2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 to 5, where the Apostle Paul writes to his young disciple Timothy about the dangers and challenges of the last days. The passage reads, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people." This passage is one of the most vivid warnings in the New Testament. It provides a detailed description of the moral and spiritual decline that will characterize humanity in the last days. To understand this passage fully, let's break it down and explore the context, its meaning, and how it applies to us in our present age. First, let's consider the context. 2 Timothy is Paul's final letter, written while he was imprisoned in Rome, awaiting execution. He knew his time was short, and this letter served as his last encouragement and warning to Timothy. Paul had mentored Timothy closely and saw in him a young leader who would carry the mantle of the gospel after his death. Thus, Paul wanted Timothy to be prepared for the difficulties he would face as a leader of the church in a world that was growing increasingly hostile to the message of Christ. Paul begins by telling Timothy to mark this, which is a strong phrase urging Timothy to take note and be fully aware of the seriousness of what is to come. He warns that there will be terrible times in the last days. In the Bible, the last days often refers to the period between Christ's ascension and his second coming, a time that stretches across history but intensifies in severity as we approach the end. This is not just about a distant future, but about the spiritual and moral realities of life in a fallen world, realities that are becoming more and more apparent. Paul goes on to describe a disturbing list of characteristics that will define people in these terrible times. Let's go through each of these traits one by one because they hold deep significance. He begins with, people will be lovers of themselves. In a culture that often promotes self-love and self-centeredness, we see this manifested in a growing obsession with self-fulfillment, self-promotion, and self-interest. The focus shifts away from God and others, and instead, people become consumed with their own desires, ambitions, and gratification. This attitude stands in stark contrast to the Christian call to humility and selflessness as modeled by Christ. Next, he says, people will be lovers of money. Greed and materialism become dominant forces, driving people to prioritize wealth over spiritual values. In the pursuit of money, moral and ethical standards are often compromised, and wealth becomes a false god, worshipped at the expense of true faith. Then, Paul mentions boastful, proud, and abusive. These are traits that reflect a lack of humility and reverence for God. People become arrogant, exalting themselves above others, and often use their words and actions to tear others down rather than build them up. The absence of kindness and gentleness leads to a breakdown in relationships and communities. He continues, saying people will be disobedient to their parents, a sign of rebellion against authority, and a disregard for family values. This rejection of parental guidance reflects a broader rejection of all forms of authority, including God's. Thank you for joining us today in this deep dive into 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 to 5. As we continue to navigate these challenging times, let us take Paul's warning seriously, remaining vigilant, prayerful, and committed to living out our faith in a way that honors God.